Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Tilda, for coming back for the third time. What's the magic?
It's my great honor and my sincere pleasure. It's so amazing. Yeah, it's touching to a degree. I feel like over the last years, I've been here in my mind many times. It's a very special thing you did here, and I want to congratulate you for returning.
Thank you, and it means a lot because we know how busy your schedule is. We also know that you really wanted to be here for our 10th edition. So I would like another round of applause for making time. So just before the pandemic, something very special happened, literally at the doorstep of the pandemic. It was the BFI fellowship that was given to you by the British Film Institute. And then what happened?
It's hard to remember what happened. I mean, I feel like we were here, and here we are again. Yes, it was a very interesting moment for me. The BFI, the British Film Institute, which some of you may know, is a really phenomenal force for good internationally, intergalactically, but certainly in the United Kingdom, it's the sort of home of cultural cinema. And it was my beginning. I made my first film with the BFI, and in fact, my most recent film with the BFI. And so to be given a fellowship, which happens to be one of my favorite words and phenomena on earth, by this alma mater was very moving. And at the same time, it was a sort of challenge because I then had 2 years to ponder what it really meant. The retrospectives are always, for those of us who think we're actually 10 years old, they're quite challenging because they're an opportunity to really marinate on what one might have done and in my case, always notice that I feel I haven't even started, so I'd better get on with it. So I had 2 quiet years to think about what a fellowship from the BFI, which was my most benign school, might mean.
Except they weren't that quiet because from what we learned, you're actually quite busy. You're working throughout the pandemic. You made 3 films, almost 4 films.
So a funny thing happened. I don't know how many filmmakers there are here and how many of them had this experience, but filmmaking didn't seem to stop. I mean, one of the reasons I think is because filmmaking is something that's quite easily bubbleable, especially a small group of people can be bubbled quite easily. And so I started at the end of the first summer of the first year of the pandemic. I made a film, which I gather was the first film for cinema that was made since the pandemic, with Pedro Almodovar. We made a short film in Spain, in Madrid, and we didn't know how to do it. We sort of fashioned a strange mask thing for me out of a piece of plastic to wear on set. We were the first people to even start to shoot in the pandemic conditions. And there are crew members that I worked with quite intensely on that film who I wouldn't recognize today without their masks. So that was the beginning. And then I have to say, since then, I've worked almost consistently because, and I don't know whether this is banks getting worried about the markets or whether it's people being worried about another pandemic or whether it's people in general worrying about the end of the world. But the films that might have been pushed into next year, very often people say, oh, no, keep developing it for another year and we'll do it in 2024. No. They said last year, let's do it, 2022. And so it was pretty full on, I have to say. I'm very happy 2022 is drawn to a close.
I think part of that was also a very huge demand for content. People were looking forward to new things and not being able to travel. But I also want to sort of share a little story about one of the films you made during the pandemic as the 3,000 Years of Longing. And may I have an image here? I think one of our volunteers can put an image which would show what I mean by that. So Dhaka Lit Fest was featured. How did that happen?
I always try to take my friends with me everywhere I go. And I was making this film with George Miller in Sydney, the great George Miller and the great Idris Elba. And this is a film about storytelling. And I play an academic, a narratologist. And I thought, she needs to have been to the Dhaka Lit Fest. She must have been at least 3 times to the Dhaka Lit Fest. So I asked for this bag, and I got it. And we had all the rights were cleared, and now it's on the big screen forever. And I remember we did several, this is a very short moment, I have to say, in the film, when I come into the house, hang about anything. One does a lot of thinking and quite a lot of feeling these days, but trying to decide what to talk about, what to share with a beautiful room of people like this, it's a little harder than it used to be, I have to confess. And I thought, what could I possibly share that might be useful? And with nudges like the BFI Fellowship and 2 years to think, it occurred to me that if I'm good for anything at this great age, it might be to pass on a truth of my own life, which is that I have done everything in fellowship, and it is still possible to do that. And the reason that I mention that is that, and I'm speaking particularly to young artists here, there's a sort of thinking, I think, whether it's not exactly a belief, but it's maybe a line that gets pushed when one is a young, emerging artist. Actually, no, a young, emerging human, that once you've sort of started to get some wind in your sails and you've started to make some kind of impact, maybe you've just written your first short story, or you've made your first film, or you've started some kind of sense of your own identity in the wider world, that you then are on your own, that you are now launched, and all the connections, all the liaisons, all the fellowship that got you there is over. Your family, your university, your friends from school, everything, even the group that you worked with to make the film or to write the book. Once you've been on your first book tour, that's it, it's just you. And some people like this. Some people find this rather fun and they get rather thrilled with themselves and they believe it. But most of us, I hazard a guess, are blindsided by this and are confused by it and made lonely by it. And I want to share very simply that it's not true. You're not alone. You can go on, like me, working for 30-something years in fellowship. You don't have to be singled out. I know I'm sitting up here talking on behalf of all of my colleagues, but I am with my friend, so I can do it. That sense of inclusion can keep going. Don't believe it. Don't believe your shyness need put you off. So if you are thinking of stepping into a making public work, if the idea that you are going to have to be singled out is putting you off, please don't let it, because it's not true. You can stay within fellowship. And I don't just mean the fellowship of your comrades, the people with whom you make work, but also with your audience, because this is also fellowship, and this is why I'm here. So that's just what I want to share with you today.
Beautiful. And you know, we were discussing this earlier about how a writer is solitary, because the art of writing is a solitary profession, and he or she is locked up in a room doing the work. But there's also the need to share the work, but that can be done with publishing. So the writer doesn't need to appear in public. But a festival like this actually brings writers, artists, speakers, thinkers together with the audience. And there's a certain energy to be gained here. And from what I've experienced, it's quite the opposite on social media. So where it seems social, but it's actually quite polarizing. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know for a fact that both of us are not on social media, but we have thoughts on that.
Well, I am literally the last person on the planet who can talk about social media, because I have never had anything to do with it at all. I mean, I am a sort of dinosaur, literally. So I really don't know. But what I can speak to is what I hear and what I sort of read off people, who very often talk about the loneliness of this supposed fellowship. And this is the great magic of an event like this. I mean, I noticed I saw a panel just a couple of hours ago in which there were 4 people, all naturally extremely fascinating and fascinated, which is important, and all incredibly respectful of one another, and all positioned a little bit around the clock from each other, and all adding to a general spiral of conversation from a slightly different angle, and never needing to disagree with one another, just adding another leaf onto the pile, and listening, and what's even more important, hearing each other. It sounds to me, from what I'm told, that's a difficult thing to do on social media. People don't tend to do that. They tend to take positions, and they tend to believe that there's only one position possible. I don't know, I'm being reductive, I'm sure. But the magic of this kind of environment, because it's not even an occasion, it's like a world you built here. I said, I remember a few years ago, this is like a spaceship, and here we are again. It does feel as if we are in a different environment, in a different landscape, and all sorts of things are possible here that I'm not going to say they're not possible out there, or down there, or up there, or wherever, but they're easier here. There's a sort of license, because people are prepared to listen to one another here, I think, and which makes people capable of speaking. I don't know. I would like to think that all the wonderful things that are capable through social media, all the ways in which people can feel politically empowered, the way in which they can actually reach each other at moments when there's no other way of reaching each other, would be bolstered by other ways of respect, mutual respect.
I think that's very important about respect. And I feel that even when I go out to have dinner with friends, And I think it's a sign of respect if they put their phone down and not look at the phone while they're having dinner. So I have difficulty with friends actually when they do that. So I actually make a point saying, if you do that, I'm not going to have dinner with you. Talking about sort of respect and work and the beauties of creation. The last project was The Eternal Daughter. I think all of that comes together in that film. And we don't have a copy of that because it hasn't been released even in the UK. It comes out, I think, in September, October time.
Maybe next year.
Or maybe next year. So I put the teaser out just as a sort of to share what's coming next. But from what I know, it's a completely improvised project, and where you work as a poet. Would you like to share the story of that with the audience?
This is the film that Hassan Sahidia showed a little clip of just now, which we're very, very proud of. This is a film that I made with my friend Joanna Hogg, who is not just the first filmmaker I ever worked with on her graduation film when we were late teenagers, but she is literally the friend I've had for the longest time. I won't call her my oldest friend because I have older friends, but I've known her since I was 10, and she is now my regular collaborator. I'm very proud and happy to say. She's an extraordinary filmmaker and a poet filmmaker, but she works in a very particular way. We made 2 films together, which you may or may not have seen, called The Souvenir, Souvenir 1 and Souvenir 2, which in fact are one film that she decided to make in 2 parts. So Souvenir 2 is not a sequel, they are one film, which we made over the last few years. Those films also were made in this way. She writes a sort of treatment, she calls it the document. It's not a script as such. She writes no dialogue. She writes, it's almost like a short story. So it might say, the scene is the Dhaka Lit Fest, in the auditorium, various exquisite people, and on the stage, Hassan and Tilda, action. And that's it. She might say they talk about a box of tissues. She might say that, but generally speaking, she doesn't even prescribe what we're going to talk about. And then we improvise. And then she will tweak our takes as we go. But the impetus of everything that's said, and crucially, everything that's not said, every gap that's left, is left to the people in front of the camera. And I find this absolutely exhilarating, this way of working. I'm now quite addicted to it. Not least because I hate learning lines, which is true. But also, I have to confess, it really satisfies the writer in me, because the choice of words, the choice of level of articulacy, the choice of rhythm is very much in my hands when I'm working with her, and I really, really love it.
It's also a beautiful continuum. I mean, you've started working with her and you come back to her. And it's been how many years is the first project?
I mean, I can't do the mathematics, but in 1983.
About 40 years?
About 40 years, Hassan. Yes, thank you for that. Around about 40 years.
Showing off my math skills.
Yeah.
39.
So 39 years. 39 years.
Or failing my math skills. Which leads me on to the next topic I want to talk about. It's one of my favorite topics, failure. So much emphasis is given on failure and what might happen if you don't study properly, and if you fail that exam, and if you don't do this, then you, especially, I mean, for me, I can say that was the routine I had at home. So you study. So if you don't study, you won't be able to ride a nice car, as though that was the sort of level of excellence to achieve. You won't be able to fly airlines. You won't be able to fly abroad. Things like that. So success was defined that way. And competition was very much part of that. So how did the boy sitting next to you, I don't know if my mother's in the audience, because this is what she would say, how did he get 2 marks more than you? And that would agonize me. And I would think my life is a complete failure, which it probably is. But I'm saying I know enough people who failed exams and did brilliantly. I mean, Nuruddin Farah, for example, he chose this afternoon. He was talking about he chose not to write this exam, and which meant he failed that year because he wanted to write a novel instead. And I was saying to Tilda earlier that because thank God he wrote that novel, he's here with us today. Everyone passes exams. We don't know who they are, but we definitely know who Nuruddin Farah is. What are your thoughts on failure?
Well, he has the sort of glorious moment of being able to admit that it was his choice. But like most people, not getting it right has always been the grace of my life. I mean, as a young person, I was always woefully underprepared for my exams. I was one of those people who was considered bright in the term time, but when it came to the exams, always did worse than expected. And, you know, there was always that slight disappointment, and then can try harder was the refrain. But for some amazing reason, it didn't put me off. It didn't make me try harder, I'm happy and proud to say. I didn't try any harder. I went on enjoying myself and risking it and throwing myself out of the window at the last minute and getting less good marks than I was supposed to. I don't know, maybe it's a sort of perversion. Maybe I knew exactly what I was doing. Maybe it was my choice, but it really, really helped my life become my life. I was supposed to get lots of good marks at my A-levels. I had a very shiny place all ready for me at Cambridge if I got certain marks, and I didn't get the marks. And as a result, I went to Africa as a volunteer for 2 years and absolutely started my life. I then went to Cambridge on my own terms in the right year, having lived for 2 years as a volunteer in Africa. So it all came right, like it tends to, by the way, if you get it wrong enough. I realized that this whole thing of getting it right, yeah, I am what my father calls contrary. I think they put me off getting it right, and they kind of made me will them into submission. And it kind of worked, to be honest. I mean, I definitely think, with the power of Captain Hindsight, that if I had gone to Cambridge at 18, having never been away from anywhere, I don't know that I certainly wouldn't be living the life that I do now. And I don't know, there's no way of imagining really practically how my life would have been. But I can say that there are treasures that I draw on every day that I gained from those 2 years that it's unimaginable without. So I'm not a great admirer of getting it right. And I don't even know what success means. It's not even failure. I don't know what failure means. I don't really know what success means, to be honest. So there you have it. I can't answer that question either.
What were you doing in Africa those 2 years?
The first year I was in South Africa in a township working in a children's home. And then the second year I was a teacher in a Harambee school in Kenya, in East Africa.
And this is just after your A-levels, before university?
Yes.
Did you know that you wanted to be an actor?
I never wanted to be an actor. I still don't want to be an actor. I was a writer, and I went to university as a writer. I got my place. I'm embarrassed about this. I've admitted this to you before, so you're making me say it again. That's failure. They gave me my place and an exhibition to college at Cambridge as a poet, and I arrived, and I completely stopped writing at that second.
What happened? Why did you stop?
Well, you know, the sad thing is that years later, I went back to Cambridge to have the bittersweet duty to open the film and film studies department, which was bittersweet because I was very happy to do it, but I was very envious because I wish it had existed when I was there. And I sat at lunch, I sat next to my old supervisor, and I admitted to her this thing, this shame that I'd been carrying of having failed my exhibition by stopping writing. And she said, oh, it happens all the time. And that shocked me. That really shocked me, that she wasn't remotely fazed by it and said it happens a lot. I don't know, something about I didn't feel I had the license to write. I didn't feel that I was really required, or that no one was I don't know, it just shut me up. But I then made great friends who were very interested in the theatre, there not being a film department. And they were directors or writers or performers, and they were making a lot of performances and productions. And they asked me to join in, and because I liked them and I wanted to hang out with them, I just got pulled into being in plays. I mean, actually, the first thing I did was direct a play, and then I started to perform. And I think in a very simple way, performing has been my way of writing for many years. It's been my way of, in a way that nobody else needs to know or understand, but a sort of weird subterranean way of me feeling my authorship between my fingers. And then, of course, being very lazy about actually writing. And in the last few years, I have started to write again. Not as a poet. I mean, I've written little poetry, very little, but I write essays now. But yes, so if you go to university as a writer, and if you stop, it's very, very, very common, apparently. Don't worry.
And your love of poetry, which is why we're doing readings tomorrow, and we're so grateful that you agreed to do that. Some excerpts from your favorite poets. Maybe you want to share a bit about that, like some of your favorite poets, who they are, some names. So I'm plugging tomorrow's panel.
I haven't even decided what to read. I'm again, a brinksman to the last.
Yeah.
No preparation, no revision. Yeah, I don't know, but suffice to say, I will only choose things that I want to read. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm sure our audience would be there. And in terms of your friendships, because I'm going to go back to friendship again, I think there were a couple of friendships that really sort of catapulted you to another sphere. One was Derek Jarman. Do you want to share a bit about that?
Well, Derek Jarman was apart from Joan Hogg, he was my first sort of artistic home. I grew up in a very loving family, but a family that always spun me the line that there were no artists in our family, which is really not true. I've discovered since my parents died that there were lots of artists in my family, but they gave me to understand that I was a complete changeling, and that art was not a thing to be done, it was a thing to own. Anyway, when I met Derek Jarman after university, I found another world, another family. And Derek, for those who don't know, and if you've heard me say this before, then forgive me, but I have to take this opportunity to infect anybody who's never heard of Derek Jarman right now. Go and find his work. Derek Jarman was an English filmmaker, writer, cultural activist, gardener, painter, extraordinary man who died of AIDS in 1994. He was one of the first people in around 1989, when he was diagnosed with HIV, to be public about his diagnosis. And for those of you who are old enough to remember those days, that was a big deal to come out publicly and name oneself infected with the AIDS virus was huge and incredibly empowering. A very strong political statement and very inclusive one. And he died in '94, and we're still missing him. But the wonderful thing is that recently, due to all sorts of efforts, his work is much more available. There have been a number of international exhibitions of his work, and his films are more available on DVD and Blu-ray. So do look to see if you can find his work, if you can. He was an extraordinary experimentalist, and he was really interested in group working collectively. I mean, this is where I learned the practical fact of collective work with him. And he always worked with a big group with some kids in it, meaning me and Sandy Powell, who, for example, is a great costume designer who's gone on to work with Martin Scorsese, and my friend Simon Fisher-Turner, who actually started working with Derek as somebody to find extras. And he's ended up being a great musician and was the composer of all the scores. We were very young. We just sort of come in out of the cold. And we always describe working with Derek or living with Derek as a sort of kindergarten. And I worked alongside him from 1985, when we made Caravaggio, which is the first film I made with him, until he died in 94. So that's 9 years. It was like a sort of playground. And the thing that I loved about that, which would set my bar, well, I would say so high, but it set my boredom threshold so low, was the life together and the conversation between all of us was the most important thing. And the films that we made and the exhibitions and the various sort of offshoots were just like the leaves. The conversation was the trunk. That was the important thing. And that's what we were all most interested in. And then every year we would make a film or two. And it wouldn't matter how they went down, these films. I mean, as it happens, they're all in the kind of classical canon now. At the time, they were kind of... I was looking forward to speaking to our friend Hanif Qureshi, who sadly couldn't make it this year, but he and I share something, which is that his films were coming out at the same time in the UK. Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, My Beautiful Laundrette. And we were usually all sort of pulled together in the same outraged article in the right-wing press for making terrible films that gave the world a very bad view of the United Kingdom. We were the sort of punk element in filmmaking, but, you know, I think we had the last laugh, to be honest. But no, Derek was a really extraordinary beacon for so many people, and I learned then to work in this way, and we were truly experimental. We didn't really know what we were doing, and he devolved authorship to all of us. That's the other thing that I learned with him. He very much said, "Oh, Sandy, you know how to make costumes, off you go and make them." And she was like 24 and had just come out of art school. Or me, you know what to do, you just play that character. And he was very empowering, and I always say that he made filmmakers of all of us, not necessarily directors, but we were all treated as filmmakers. We all felt that we shared authorship for the work. And that set the course for me. And I've gone on, after he died, I was very stuck because I'd lost not only my best friend, but also my way of working. And I thought, I wasn't a professional, and I certainly wasn't an actor. And then fortunately, over the years, people have continued to sort of either seek me out, or I've met them on the road and we've started a conversation of our own. And now I have many families. I have a family with Wes Anderson, who I've worked with several times, with Jim Jarmusch, with Joanna Hogg, with Lynn Ramsey, Bong Joon-ho. People who also want to work in this way, Apachapong, where it's ethical. People who, it's not so uncommon to want to work in this way, I now discover. I'm very grateful for it.
You know, the thing I really like about that is when you say, we didn't know what we were doing, you still did it.
Yeah.
That takes courage. And I think if you just go through it, because sometimes I think we all of us sort of overthink things and we get stuck. Whether it's writing a novel, running a business, doing something, think too hard and then trying to get the solution, end product, and we want to bring it forward. And I think the journey is more important than the end product.
Well, it's very interesting, Asan, that you say that it takes courage, because I was caught when you said that. Because the truth is, in my experience, when you're with your mates, you can do it. You just throw yourself out the window. I imagine by yourself, and you're talking to the constipated writer here. Yeah, there's more courage needed for the solo exploit. But when you are, and I'm constantly trying to encourage myself to believe that even writing is a collective business, because one's writing with the ears or with the eyes of one's readers. I think to encourage that sense that you are in fellowship always, even if you feel that you're by yourself, writing, as you say, locked alone in a room. You make it sound so great. No. All the communication's open always. I think if one can encourage oneself to know that one is in fellowship always, then less courage is needed and more delight.
Very well put. I want to talk about Orlando, because we're also screening the film. We got the rights to screen the 30th anniversary of Orlando. It's a very dear project of yours, and the book as well, the novel, is one of your favorites. I want you to share the story, how it all started, because I know there was a funding issue there, you didn't raise money, but you still made it, and it's now in its 30th year.
So Orlando, I'm very, very happy that you're going to see, or those of you who are going to see Orlando today. 30 years old, and in my view, I saw it recently. We showed it at Glastonbury last year to a very young and enthusiastic audience, and it looks, to my eyes, very fresh. It's a film by Sally Potter, who is certainly the person who bears the beacon of courage for this one, because she had the idea to make a film of the unfilmable book. I've worked on a number of film adaptations, not that many, but they've always been of books that people say are unfilmable. It's usually a good sign in my view. But this was one, and everybody said Orlando is absolutely impossible to film. And she approached me in, I want to say, 1988. And now, I have to say, the 5 years that it took for us to get it together is nothing compared to some gestation periods that I've gone through with other filmmakers. I made a film with Luca Guadagnino, I Am Love, which took 12 years. I made a film with Apichatpong Where It's Setical, which we talked about for 17 years. I would say that Joanna Hogg and I have been talking about The Eternal Daughter on and off since we were 10. But it's good, you have a long time to figure it out. But 5 years it took to convince anybody to give us any money. Because the thing about Orlando, when we made it, the idea of the costume film was absolutely, it's not possible. Certainly a costume film that had a slight edge. The only ways of making costume films in the 80s were to make first of all, very, very, very expensive films. There was this absolute understanding that they would be very expensive. And there's no doubt about it, films with big pannier dresses do tend to be more expensive than films with just a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. But not just for the costume budget. There's all sorts of things to think about the negotiation with the environments that tend to make costume films very expensive. But also there was an idea that they were either nostalgic or in some way a little bit stuffy. And we wanted to make something quite radical and cheap. So no one could quite understand how this was going to work out. Also, Sally Potter and I at that time had absolutely no profile at all. She'd made a few quite well received, but very much under the radar experimental films. And I'd worked with Derek Jarman, so nobody knew anything about us. But somehow we managed to raise the money. The first money we raised, interestingly enough, was Russian. We went around the world trying to raise money for this book, which of course is a great classic, a masterpiece by Virginia Woolf. Which of course a lot of people had read, but they couldn't understand. They said, what's the plot? What's the story? And we'd say, well, it's about immortality and androgyny and class. And they said, well, what's it about? And we'd say, well, it's about immortality and androgyny and class. And they said, but what's the story? And we said, well, it's about immortality. And we said that in Russia when we went to look for locations, because there's a very important section that takes place on the frozen River Thames. And not having a lot of money, we knew that it had to be real, because we couldn't afford to make it in a studio, which is what studio pictures do. And these colleagues we were talking to about locations said, so this film, what's it about? And we said, well, it's about immortality and androgyny. And they said, oh, we know all about that. We're perfectly happy to be your collaborators. And so we actually were the first international co-production with a Russian company, Lenfilm. It was when the big studios were just sort of refracting, and we became a Russian, Dutch, French, German, I can't remember, 30 years later, and a little bit of money from the UK. Co-production.
And Orlando is also your favorite novel by Woolf, but you're not that much of a fan of her other works.
I love Woolf as an essayist, and also I love her letters. I like the gaps in her writing. I've never been, this is sacrilege to say this. Breaking news.
It's a love letter saying, we're in love.
Stage. Okay, yes. Only 15 minutes left. Okay. Only 15 minutes, should I shut up? And we talk, okay. Yes, I like her, I like the air in her writing, and the novels, it is sacrilegious to say, because of course they are established masterpieces, but the Light to the Lighthouse and the way, I love Mrs. Dalloway. I like the gaps in Mrs. Dalloway. I like the inarticulacy in her. I mean, I like inarticulacy, clearly, in general, but I love inarticulacy in a writer, and she embraces inarticulacy sometimes in her essays, for sure, in Mrs. Dalloway, for sure, and in Orlando, she celebrates inarticulacy, I think. And they're the unsocialized novels. I think the social novels they're a little fluid for me.
It's beautifully answered, and I'll open the floor because literally we have this threat. There's 15 minutes left for questions. So, right at the back. Three.
Standing, not just waving, but standing.
Hello, Tilda. As an actor, I would like to know about your preparation for a role. How you would like to prepare for a role in a performance? Very basic stage. How you prepare yourself?
That's a very interesting question, because I have no idea how I'm going to answer it. Well, as I've said, I usually have the great good fortune to have a long time to think about something. And I generally develop the project with the filmmaker. So it helps me that I know, I'm distracted from the performance element completely. I'm much more interested in what the film is, what the landscape is, what the frame is, what the actual beat in the rhythm of the trajectory of the piece is. And then at the last minute, I might ask myself, what note, it is a sort of musical business for me, I think, what note does the portrait that I'm portraying here need to hit in this particular moment? And I think it's an interesting combination of very banal practical stuff, like what does this person look like? How do they present themselves to other people? What do they wear? How do they walk? What's the rhythm of their interaction? How do they speak? Things like that, like a slightly forensic work. But more generally, I sort of go frame by frame. You can tell I'm not an actor, right? I tend to go frame by frame when the cinematographer will show me the frame, and I will look at it, usually through the camera, but sometimes on a monitor, and I will figure what I'm sharing the frame with. Then that will inform me how I'm going to take up the space that I need to take up in the frame. I know this is not the way what I call real actors talk. I know that especially actors who work a lot in the theatre will talk about something much more interior and much more self-propelled. But I'm very interested in, and I mean very invested in the visual effect of the film. And I know that if I'm sharing a frame with a large standard lamp or an elephant, that's really important to me. And I will present myself differently if I'm alone or if I have Hassan Akbar sitting beside me.
Hello, Tilda. First of all, I wanted to say that Only Lovers Left Alive is one of my favorite films of all time.
Mine too.
A while back, you were talking about immortality, and one of the key themes of Only Lovers Left Alive is the agony of immortality that you portray. You also portrayed the agony of immortality while you were playing the Ancient One in Doctor Strange. I wanted to ask the question is that, what are the differences you feel that, when you have to portray your feelings while you're acting, when you're in a practical set or when you're around the green screen when in Avengers or, in 3000 Years of Longing?
If I understand you correctly, you're asking a different attitude towards
Yes,
different projects. I would say I'm so kindergarten that there's no difference at all. I approach everything in exactly the same way. But the question about immortality is a really great one. And it's true that I have, and you're just about, if you're going to stay, you're going to see another film about an immortal being. Orlando Lives Forever. And that's the draw for me. The idea of consistency. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about Orlando, which I know is not what you asked, but just in terms, it might answer the question about him playing immortality. You will see with Orlando starts life, spoiler alert, starts life as a young man, and at a certain point wakes up a woman. And there has been a sort of, the story that's usually told about Orlando is that it's about a sex change. I know that this is true not only of our film, but also of the book. And for my money, it's not about gender at all. It's not really interested in gender. It's about openness, and it's about consistency. So my fantasy, I'm always saying, about Virginia Woolf's book, is that if Orlando had gone on living, if she'd written another 500 pages, maybe Orlando would have turned into a spaniel or a bottle of water. That it's not about male to female or female to male, or it's not really interested in genders at all. It's about freedom and boundarylessness. And what I wanted to mention was when Sally Potter and I were thinking about how the practical business of how I was going to play this young man and this woman, we started to think about differences. And very quickly we realized that wasn't actually our task. What we needed to do was to look at the consistency. How would Orlando not change? How would the essence of Orlando as an Elizabethan nobleman be identical to the essence of Orlando as a 20th century woman? And so looking at that consistency was so much more interesting to me. And by the way, what I found really interesting in playing Eve in Only Lovers Left Alive, how do you find a spirit and play an immortal spirit who's basically the same in the 13th century and the 17th century and the 19th century and the 21st century and beyond? That, I think, is just gold dust. I'm very interested in that. So looking at consistency really is what draws me to those portraits.
I read a comment online that says that Tilda Swinton collects art house directors like Pokemon. And that's true. You've worked with like directors with the like of Almodovar, Wes Anderson, and I think even like Bellatar. So I gotta ask, what other directors are you interested in collecting?
That's such a lovely thing. Well, let's say I'm the collected one. I'm happy to be collected. I'm available to be collected, and I'm open, absolutely open to be collected in the great Pokemon game of cinema and life.
Hi, Tilda. I would just like to say that it's absolutely incredible to hear someone talk about loneliness and community and family at the same time. To know that it can coexist. My question is about the different mediums of art that you engage in. I know that like once you become successful or once you have achievements in one medium, like as a writer and you gain recognition, it kind of becomes your identity, and it can be a bit difficult to engage in different other mediums, even though you might feel drawn towards it. But I saw you do this performance art where you had these gowns that you put on, and that was so inspiring. So I would like to ask you, how do you have the courage to like do different mediums, you know, instead of just sticking to acting?
Well, I am going to answer your question, but I'm also going to ask you a question. Why might it be difficult? You don't have to answer it, because I think I know what you might say. Why might it be difficult? I suggest it's difficult if you listen to other people telling you it's difficult. I mean, I don't know. I was never, this is maybe one of the gracious things in my life, is that I never, as I said, not only was I not trained, there's no sort of either private or state-sponsored investment in my success as anything. I am completely untrained. Cambridge graduate, completely untrained. So that's genuinely an advantage, I think. I mean, I don't want to diss arts education. Please don't say that I did. But I think if you do go through an arts education, that's an extra thing you have to battle, maybe. Because there may be this feeling of you owe it. You owe it to be that successful potter because you actually did a ceramics course at university that your parents put you through or whatever. It's very important that you make it work. I don't know, but you know what I mean. That sort of feeling of pressure might exist in a way that it has never existed for me, because I've just constantly been throwing myself off the parapet. I think just you are an artist, and that's it. You don't need any more job description than that, and you will be an artist whatever you do. You're an artist in the way you bring up your children. You're an artist in the way you decorate your house. You are an artist, so you don't have to limit yourself, and you certainly don't have to listen to anybody else telling you what kind of artist you are.
Hello, Tilda.
Hello.
It's so nice of you to be here. So I almost watched all of your films. So yesterday I watched one of your films called We Need to Talk About Kevin, which I thought was magnificent. And there is a scene in that film where you were checking a letter where Bangladesh was written in it. And it made me really glad that our country is being represented before 3,000 years of longing.
Always, in every film I'm going to, even probably in Orlando.
So my question was, so out of all the remarkable films that you offered us, so is there any films that you enjoyed most working on, and is there any favorite of yours?
Oh my goodness, that's a little bit like asking somebody who their favorite child is. I mean, so many different experiences. Orlando is very precious to me because it was the first adventure of this kind, even though I've said it was only 5 years that I had been on. And it was the first time that I was in every frame of a film. And that's a very particular thing because, you know, you can pop up in an amusing way in and out of your friends' films for a scene or two. And that's a different kind of work because you're entering. It's a little bit like someone throws a dinner party and you come along with the pudding. But when you throw the party yourself, it's a particular responsibility and it's a particular grace because you get to unfold it at your own pace. And that was the first time that I'd done that. But I will say there's a film that's very near to my heart, which is very recent, which is a film I made called Memoria with Apachapong Receptacle. I don't know if it's been released here. Oh, somebody's seen it.
Available on movie.
What?
I only watched Uncle Bunmi.
Oh, yeah, well, that's a masterpiece, but
Yes,
you
ma'am.
somebody has to try and find Memoria. We were hoping, weren't we? Next year, okay. This is an extraordinary film. He is a great, great artist working today. Again, if you don't know of his work, I'm going to repeat his name. Apachapong Receptacle. Okay? We call him Joey. He's a great master working today. I'm proud to tell you that I'm talking to him about making another film with him. That might take another 17 years. But we made that film in Colombia. And that was an extraordinary experience because we were in Colombia with this extraordinary, very young, very cineastic crew. And that film's particularly interesting, I may say, because when it was released in 2021, beginning of 22, Neon, the distributor in the United States, agreed to let us release it only in cinemas. In the United States, it will never be streamed, and you will never get a DVD. You will only ever see it on the big screen. And it is still going. I actually did an interview with the IFC channel 2 days before coming here about this never-ending roadshow. It's going from town to town in the United States, one screen at a time. And people are buying a ticket for it months in advance, like you do for a rock concert. You know, you say, oh, the Rolling Stones are coming to Dhaka. In a year's time, you buy the ticket, you put it on your refrigerator, and you wait. And that is happening with Memoria. And it's so exciting because people are doing it. They are responding to that. So at a time when people are talking more and more nonsense about big cinema being dead or being threatened, we are showing that it's not true. I mean, there are few wonderful things, very few wonderful things about the pandemic. Very few. But one of them is this. I would suggest that all of us, when we were asked, what do we miss the most during the lockdown? We all said the same things. We said friends and family, travel, live music, and cinema. Everybody, not just cinematic people like me, everybody missed big cinema. And so, in a way, it was quite a wonderful riposte to those people who say, the streamers will see the end of big cinema. Not so. So, I don't know, this is just an opportunity for me to say, keep going to big cinema, keep going to big cinema. It's a different thing watching it on the end of your bed. Please keep going to big cinema.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
It's a
More questions which we'll answer tomorrow. Yeah, we had one.
See you around. I'm going to be wandering around. I'll see you later. Come and find me. We have to go. See you next year.